Hello, and welcome to Temple of the False Pod, where our decks are not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
And we're a podcast that we talk about magic casually. We casually talk about casual magic.
Yeah.
Normally we talk about Commander this season, because it's season 6. Flavorfully, talking about 60 card, because it's what we like as well. We wanted to talk about, so a lot of basics around deck building in general, certain ideas that carry over throughout most formats, but we're anchoring it in 60 card and trickling into Commander because can't get away. So today we're getting even more into the weeds of how does it get structured? How does 60 card get structured? You have 24 lands ish, and that means you've got 36 non-lands.
Right.
So where do we start? I mean,
well, way back,
like the 80s?
No, not that far back. Like early Magic time,
like 2002.
Maybe even a little late 90s.
Oh.
There was a handful of articles that talked about a deck building style, and the idea was that when you were building your 60 card, and the focus was on competitive play, so your 60 card standard deck or your 60 card legacy or whatever format that you were going to play.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was that you stopped looking at it as 60 cards, because it's not really 60 cards.
Right.
It's
62.
Well, it could be. The idea
mm-hmm.
that someone had come up with, and honestly I don't even know who it was.
I'll take credit. It was me.
It was the it was the idea of pardon me. It was the idea of 9x4.
Okay.
Now the idea is 9 times 4 is 36. There are 36 cards in a deck normally that aren't lands. The idea was, instead of looking to build your deck and you're looking at 36 cards to put in your deck, in a format where you're allowed 4 copies of something, you're going to build the deck and you're going to maximize it at every opportunity, so you're going to choose the same card 4 times because you're allowed to. This just meant that why would you put variations of a card
mm-hmm.
when you could just put 4 copies of it? So to maximize a deck, you would put 4 copies of every single card that you're going to put in it, with the theory being it's going to be the best card. You're going to choose the best option of the options available, that, so that block of 4 cards do the thing you want done in the best way of all the available cards.
Mm-hmm.
So it started out as sort of a deck maximization, but it also meant that deck building itself was going to be, it would just made it more straightforward. You weren't looking at 36 cards, you're looking at 9 cards.
Oh.
Because if you're going to choose, if you want a way to ramp your deck, then pick whatever you think the best ramp card is and put 4 copies in. Now, is your deck going to be creature centered, or is it focused around a combo? Because if it's focused around a combo, well, then you're going to take the pieces of your combo, put 4 copies of each, and suddenly that makes it so much easier to build because you've only got 9 slots.
Mm-hmm.
So you're looking for 9 cards. So if your combo is 2 or 3 cards, well, now you've got 6 cards left to fill out your deck.
That both relaxes me knowing that, like, oh, well, like, that's easy, choosing 9 cards, that's
right.
Easy, but that also gives me so much anxiety trying to narrow it down to 9 cards.
Right. Well, see, and this is where we start to see variation with this idea. So the idea of this 9x4
mm-hmm.
then gets ported over into casual play with this for the same reasoning. I mean, we're talking pre-Commander here. So it's just, okay, well, it's so much easier to build not having to find 36 cards if all you have to do is find 9. Just find 9 and build your deck around that. And that was well and good, but it's casual play, and most casual players at that time who were running any sort of casual deck probably didn't have 4 copies of the card. And honestly, you're playing casually. You're not really looking to max it out quite that hard.
Yeah.
However, the concept behind it made good sense because it forced you to structure the way you built your deck, and it allowed you to really align. So for new deck builders like myself at the time, it just made things so much easier. Suddenly I understood, well, you want to have some removal in your deck. Okay. Well, now I just need, I'm gonna allocate one of those 9 slots to removal. Great. Well, maybe I don't have 4 copies of one piece of removal, but I probably have 4 pieces of removal that could fit into that one slot of 4.
Right.
So then I just put 4 different cards in there.
Yeah.
And, I'll try and choose the best of what I've got. But, so in the end you start building your decks, and it's like, okay, so what do I want my deck to do? I've got Prodigal Sorcerer. I've got something that can untap the Prodigal Sorcerer. I want to try and create a loop that's going to tap and untap him. So I find the cards that are going to do that. Maybe it's 3 of them. Maybe there's 4 of them. So I put those in the deck and try and find either 4 copies of whatever the card is, or find 4 copies of something that does that, with the idea being that my goal is to build this deck and get to the point where I can then loop the Prodigal Sorcerer so it'll tap for a point of damage and somehow get it untapped and tap it again and just repeat that until everybody's dead.
So, quite the loop.
It would be quite the loop.
For those who don't know, because it is an old card.
Sure.
Prodigal Sorcerer is 2 and a blue for a 1/2?
2 and a blue for a 1/1.
A 1/1 that says you can tap it to deal 1 damage to target, I think is the Oracle text. It's just to any
1 damage
target.
to a target. So, I'm just using this as an example. Honestly, it sounds like a terrible 60 card deck where if that's your focus is to try and create a combo that can then infinitely go off and kill everybody.
Sounds like a great combo.
It's there. It's there. It's more just we're just sort of as an explanation of this whole 9x4.
Right. I think it's a perfect example because you may not have 4 of the card Prodigal Sorcerer.
Right.
It's you won't find that card printed again because it's a red effect.
Right.
But that said, there's a red version. Prodigal Pyromancer?
Yes.
There's also, I think, 2 other cards in blue that do the same thing.
There are
for the same price. There's,
there are many.
There are a handful. And if you dig through any bulk bin at any LGS, you'll find all of them. And I think that you may have stumbled into the perfect example because you may not find 4 Prodigal Sorcerers. You can find 4 of the same effect.
Yeah.
And that is the point, is because you're trying to find 9 things that your deck can do, put in 4 copies of that effect, and now you have 36 cards. Where efficiency comes in, where optimization comes in, is when the cards that you put into those slots reach into other groups.
Right.
You can have a card that does, a modal card. Like, I don't know why this is the first one that came to mind. Maybe because we've got blue in my mind. Cryptic Command.
Sure.
Anything that has choose one or more. It does multiple things, sometimes at the same time, and you slot it in as removal. You can slot it in as counter. You can slot it in as card draw. So it's great in that instance.
Well, the benefit of that is that's sort of what takes you to the next step. What you find when you're building a deck where you essentially have 9 slots. Now, I've been describing each slot as one card. So like the Prodigal Sorcerer.
Right.
But it's not really the Prodigal Sorcerer slot. It's the
Tap to pay.
card that taps to do 1 point of damage.
Right.
That's what that slot's about. Now, as soon as you get a card like Cryptic Command, well, suddenly that card can go in any of the 4 slots, which adds way more flexibility to your deck.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we just talked about this last week, or we've talked about this before with lands. I say last week. I just listened to the podcast last week. Sorry, this is the difficulty of doing podcasts several weeks ahead. But when you've got a dual land, it fits into either slot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the same is true for a card like Cryptic Command and a lot of the other cards. And this is why so many of these other cards are so valuable in so many decks, because you can put them in any one of those slots.
Right.
And in theory, depending on how you want to build, you can argue that one card fits or fills the space in each of those slots.
Right.
So then you only need three other cards to fill in all of those slots. Or in theory, I guess, 3 more Cryptic Commands, and suddenly all 3 of those slots of 12 cards are now being solved by 1 slot of 4, which means you now have 8 extra card slots, which if you're a casual player, great, I just got 8 more cards I get to throw in the deck. So you end up looking a lot. You do look a lot for these cards that can do more than one thing.
Right.
This is why in so many Temple's Treasures we talk about charms, or we talk about cards that can do, that fill in more than one slot. Nobody wants a 4/4 creature for 3 mana that does nothing else. Okay, that's a roadblock, or that's something that can attack, but you want more. You want an enter the battlefield trigger that's going to do something. You want a card that can, the strongest commanders out there right now are the ones that can do 2 or 3 different things.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what you're looking for. And you really start to understand why these kind of cards are broken or are so valuable in Commander and in any casual format, because they fill in multiple slots. And that's sort of when you're looking at this 9x4 style of deck building, that kind of card is super valuable.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it is kind of like the next step beyond the 9x4, because obviously you've got, when I started, before I knew about things like Architect or Moxfield,
mm-hmm.
you kind of start building your decks in like spreadsheets.
Yeah.
So you've got, your lists of like, all right, like I've got these 9 things that my deck can do. You put in the 4 copies of each card.
Right.
And then your next step is inevitably like, oh, like I don't need, 4 Goblin Chain Whirlers. It'd be great, but, whatever. Maybe I don't have it, et cetera,
right.
et cetera. Basically, that slot is like, all right, big payoff for goblins or whatever. And you start to switch out certain copies and find cards that like we're talking
mm-hmm.
about, fill different slots. And then that makes space for other cards. And that makes, it makes your deck be able to either do more things or do those very specific things more often.
Right. Well, with 9x4,
mm-hmm.
you only have 9. Essentially, the idea is you only have 9 options.
Right.
So it's supposed to make deck building easier. Let's simplify things. Instead of finding 36, you're finding 9. Okay, great. What you quickly find is when you're building your casual deck and you want this card to work with this card to do this, then make this thing, and you want these interactions, they take up most of your slots.
Yeah.
But you still want to have a way to ramp. You're still going to need removal. So those are dedicated slots. Well, suddenly now you just don't have room for everything you want in your deck, because you're being forced to reduce it all down to 9. that's when you start looking at cards like, take your pick, any card that does double duty, because it opens up space to fit in the other cards that you really want to make work with your casual deck.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, because we brought up modal cards, but I think what is more interesting concept is things like, for instance, your Pure and Toothy deck.
Yeah.
Either of them in your 60 card deck serves essentially three purposes. One, to find the other piece. Two, some sort of card draw or counter manipulation. And then three, it's a beater. Like, so all in all, you've got, I know that this isn't the case, but 8 slots dedicated to those three things already.
Right.
I think in actuality the deck has 7, but whatever. And it's interesting when you start to get into the weeds with creatures specifically, because I mean they always serve that last purpose of, well, you can attack with them.
Yeah.
And I think that not to get too deep into it, but combat is become secondary to a lot of people in casual play. They want to just be left alone, do their thing, and voila, their deck is hard to deal with. But I think finding those special creatures that do double duty, triple duty in this case, is always fascinating, especially when you add more copies and more copies into a 60. And I'm building a deck now for Deck Tales in a couple weeks. That I'm playing with the mechanic of having multiple legends, similar to your Pure and Toothy deck, where you're intentionally putting out multiple copies so that you can sack one of them and get a benefit without needing to have a sack outlet, without needing to rebuild after you lose the original.
Right.
And so it's those interesting nuances where you not only are playing double duty with whether it's actually legend or I still love the idea of having a prodigal sorcerer deck, because I mean, you start playing it, people will be like, they'll either take you out real fast because they know you're not doing anything, or they'll let you be, more likely, until you've got a battlefield of 1/1s that just ping, and then with that example, you probably are looking for ways to give them death touch so you can start picking off your opponent's creatures, and then you build up to some sort of big payoff to finish the game.
Well, I will say I had a prodigal sorcerer deck.
Right, didn't everybody?
Well, and mine was green-blue, and it was prodigal sorcerer and was it Rootwater Hunter and another kind of sorcerer and another kind. I believe there were 16 of them in the deck, along with 3 Seedborn Muse, because why wouldn't you want to untap them every turn?
Right.
And the level of redundancy in the deck basically meant that if I did get the Seedborn Muse out with at least 2 or 3, I can't remember how many, of the sorcerer type creatures, it made life absolutely miserable for opponents, because if you can do 3 points of damage to anything in any variation,
right,
every turn.
Yeah, and then if you get more muses out, it's a trigger, right? So
yeah,
you can stack it so that you do it before each resolves, and then
so you're taking out opponents' creatures whenever they even consider attacking you, and it was It was fun. It was fun for a little while, and then it just became kind of boring because everybody knew what the plan was and where I was going.
Good job, Bruce.
Well, and that was 4x9.
Right.
That was just four. It's just that 5 of those slots were dedicated to creature that does 1 point of damage, as opposed to 1 slot.
Right.
So, so the deck became a little redundant. When you talk about this 9x4 option, it's that's the whole point of the deck, is to create the redundancy that allows a deck to be viable in the long term. When you're building a 60 card casual deck, you don't want your entire deck to revolve around a card and you've only got 1 copy of it, or even 1 copy of or even 1 version of a card that does something that's essential to your deck.
Right.
So, I keep saying 4 copies of a card, but this is casual. You don't need 4 copies of propaganda. If you've got a propaganda, a ghostly prison, and I'm trying to remember the name of the other cards that do the same thing. But
right.
Essentially, that's what I'm talking about, is you want to be able to build some redundancy in so that if one of them is lost, you have another one that you can fall back on.
Absolutely. And
so,
yeah. And I think that kind of touches on the idea that, like, we talked about this in a previous episode where, how many copies of a thing in a deck do you want? And I think 4 is the perfect place to start because it's, your maximum.
Sure.
And if the effect that a card is giving you is important enough, don't go with 1.
Right.
And it's interesting too, because I've heard it another way where you want, generally speaking, 6 copies of an effect, which is where I think this overlap comes
right.
in. Because, 4 copies of a card is good. 4 copies of an effect is good.
Right.
And if you want to be more consistent, 6 copies, whether it's 3 and 3 or 4 and 2, or
right.
It gives this variety. It forces a variety, honestly, unless you can play more than 4 copies of a card.
I really find I like the 9x4. If for no other reason, then it's a very easy way to lay out for a newer player or someone newer to the format. Here, here's a basic structure for you to start with, for you to follow. Obviously, 9x4 really doesn't take into consideration, if one of your 4 cards is a 6 mana card, has a mana value of 6 or more, you probably don't want 4 copies of that card, just because with 4 copies, the likelihood of it being in your opening hand is pretty good. Maybe you don't want 4, you probably want 3. But the 9x4 is...
It's solid.
It's solid, and it's a great way for new players to understand that, you must, you need removal. Okay, but I have removal. I have two cards that do removal. I'm like, yes, out of 60. But if you go with the 9x4, it means one of those slots has to be removal, and you can't skimp on it. And one of those slots has to be something, and you can't skimp on that either, because you want the consistency in your deck. And it really pushes that for the new player who's like, yeah, but I've got 2 cards that do this and it's really good, and I'm going to put those 2 cards in. I'm like, okay, that's great, but that's a start. You have to have 2 more cards that back that up, that can also fill the rest of that slot for the effect that you want.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because like you've got the 4 copies, 4 copies of 9 cards. Love it. Where I get lost, I always forget removal. I always forget utility artifacts.
I do the same thing.
I see, these 6, 9, etc. cards work really well together, and then you forget about interaction. You forget about beyond your own battlefield.
Right.
And what gets me is like, okay, like I've got creature removal. Great. What about artifact, enchantment?
Right. To me, that's really where this pays off. Because you're starting with 9 slots, You don't have to name it after one card. You can just be like, okay, I have 9 slots to fill. What are the things that I need to have in every deck? You're going to want some card draw, and it really doesn't matter what deck it is, unless you've got, unless you've got Prodigal Sorcerer, and that's the card you want, and you've got 12 versions of it. You're going to want card draw to find some of the stuff that you're in there. So that becomes an automatic block. That's one of your set of 4. Well, now it means you understand that you can't use up that slot for anything other than deck building or anything other than card draw, sorry. So it just makes sense. And then that way, when you find a card that is card draw, you can put it in that slot. But if you don't, you have to dedicate those slots to some kind of card draw. And you can't just let that go by. And I feel that kind of a structure is great for new deck builders.
Yeah. Where I think one of the biggest issues I have is sticking to it. I'll give up this card draw for this removal and then never replace the card draw, which is troublesome.
Right.
And I think it kind of leads directly into why Commander ends up being such a popular format, especially for casual play, because like we've been talking about, maybe you don't have 4 copies of a card.
Right.
But for Commander, all you need is 1.
Yes.
Which we will get to when we get back from our break. Let's throw it to our sponsor. And then when we come back, we'll talk about how the 4x9 can translate into building a Commander deck.
Sounds good. This episode of Temple of False Pod is brought to you by Avatar of Hope. For when you need a good 4/9 creature. Go with flying. Go with Avatar of Hope.
Welcome back. We've been talking about 4/9, 4x9.
Yeah.
4 copies of 9 cards is a great place to start structuring your deck. Now, what if I told you that one of the most popular formats in Magic only allows you to play 1 copy of each card?
Then let me introduce you to a brand new theory. All new. Something you've probably never even thought about. Let's talk about 9x7.
9x7?
9x7.
That makes 63.
That makes 63, which is roughly the number of cards in a commander deck that aren't lands. I think it's probably 3 too many. But as I continue my quest to convince everyone that 40 lands is the correct number of lands in your deck, however, for this theory, let's go with 9x7. And the idea here, part of the reason I've transferred this over is I've had more than one person say to me when they're building their commander deck that the idea of starting with that blank slate is just overwhelming.
Oh, absolutely.
Just what do you do? Where the commander, everything. It's just overwhelming, and they can't get started because they're looking for 100 different cards. And even when you figure, take those 37 lands away,
right?
You're still looking for 63 cards, and no rhyme or reason to any of it. You just need to come up with 63, and 63 sounds like a massive number of cards to figure out.
Yeah. So now, you've got 30,000 cards to look at.
Yeah.
So most people start with their commander.
Right.
So there. You got, 36 lands, a commander. You've got 64, 63-ish other cards to work with. 63, because it's, 36 and 1. Great.
Okay.
Now you've cut your deck, or you've cut your selection down to, let's say, a third of that. You've got 10,000 cards to work with because of your commander identity alone.
So congratulations. Now you only have to find 63 cards out of that 10,000. And you're still talking about a level of paralysis to even get started. So what 9x7 is going to do for you is it's going to say, what exactly is it that you're trying to do? So, for example, let's choose a legend.
Let's choose a legend. Do you want a multicolor legend?
Yes.
All right. Let's go with world famous Raf Capuchin. It's a 2 in white blue. It's flash flying. It says you can play historic spells as though they had flash. It's a 3/3. I believe.
Right. Okay. So you now have, you've got Raf Capuchin, and you have 9 slots.
Mm-hmm.
What are your 9 slots for Raf Capuchin? First off, Raf costs 4, and he's a 3/3.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to play your spells as though they had flash, you're going to want a lot of mana. Because the idea is you're going to wait till the end of the turn, but you have to be showing a lot of mana to begin with, so that people think that you're going to do more than just one thing. So you want some ramp. So one of your slots is going to be dedicated to ramp. Now you need another slot that's going to involve removal, because every deck needs some level of removal, whether it's enchantment, artifact, creature, planeswalker, whatever. You're going to want a slot for removal. Now, every one of these slots is 7 cards, but let's not worry about that for now. Because right now, you've got 9 slots, and you've already filled 2 of them. Now,
this is going by
so
easy.
you've got ramp, you've got removal. Well, if you're going to cast these cards at flash speed, you've got to have cards to cast. So let's draw some cards too. So now we've got 3 of your slots filled. Because we've now got ramp, removal, and card draw.
Bruce is just filling up all my slots.
We're down to 4 slots.
Okay.
So the remaining 4 slots, what do you want to put in them?
4 slots? Are we doing 7? Sorry. Are we doing 7 copies of 9 cards or 9 copies of...
Sorry, yes.
Okay, so we've got
so
6
we still have
slots
6 slots left. But we've now reduced it to only 6 slots. So you're looking at Raf Capuchin. You can cast historic spells as though they had flash. Well, then you want to take advantage of that. You're going to want...
Historic spells.
Right. You're going to want historic spells. Well, how many slots of historic spells do you want?
Yeah.
Because if every slot has 7, you're going to want more than just 1 slot of historic spells. So...
Which also is great, too, because historic is generally a broad term.
Right.
You know, you almost definitely already have historic spells in just your ramp.
Right.
Historic, for those who don't know, include sagas, legendaries, and artifacts.
Right.
So, there you go.
Right. And so once you've set up what your next 6 slots are, because now you're looking at, see, artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. Okay. Well, assuming you're going to want creatures...
Make them legendary.
Well, you're going to want legendary creatures or artifact creatures or enchantment creatures. And when you start talking about, other ways to make, then you're going to want a slot for protection, because you're going to want to be able to cast these cards at flash speed, and you're not going to want Wrath getting blown out of the sky over and over again.
Right.
So that's a 4th slot filled. So now you're down to 5 slots. And what are you going to do with those 5 slots? Well, then you're going to start looking at what Wrath does and filling those slots based on that. And you can, maybe it's a slot for flying creatures. Maybe it's a slot for, it depends on where you want to take Raf Capuchin. I mean, you can be very generic and just look at those slots and say, we want to fill them with any kind of historic spell. Or maybe you want, or maybe you've decided that Raf, because it's blue-white, maybe it should be loaded down with a lot of legendary flyers. So, okay, so that's a slot. And then once you've got all of the slots filled, then you start going back down each of those slots and saying, how does this work? So, Andy, like you were saying with ramp, the ramp slot is obviously, you're not going to be loading it up with Smothering Tithe.
Right.
Because it's an enchantment. It doesn't fit the theme of the deck at all. Why would you do that when you can when Soul Ring and Arcane Signet and
Azorius Signet, key runes, and...
Exactly. And so all of these fit the theme. Yeah. They can all come out at flash speed, and you've done all this. Now, if you add in Commander Sphere as one of your ramp spells, Well, it also allows you to draw a card. So maybe you want to take that commander sphere out and put it into the card draw slot. Or maybe you don't, because we are talking about white and blue.
Right.
Card draw shouldn't be something that's difficult to find. But in your card draw slot, you're going to choose your 7 cards that go in that slot. They're going to be 7 different ones because it's commander. But, so I mean, you can see where this is going.
Right.
But it gives you that structure to start. And then once you've finished building it, then you can look at it and say, does this really make sense? Do I need to dedicate an entire slot to this? I would argue that you want to be very careful about removing cards from a slot to add something somewhere else. But once you get more comfortable with the deck, you can certainly do this. But this just gives you that basic structure to start with, so that you're not missing glaring errors in your deck. I mean, I don't know how many times I built decks and then, realize afterwards, like, this deck would be so much better if I had just put in some card draw, because I have none. Or depending on your meta, or perhaps I built this black deck with Phyrexian Arena and other ways to draw cards, but they all make me lose life. And I'm losing life at much too high a pace, and it turns out I didn't put anything in that gains me any life. So, but these are things that get covered when you're building and you're starting out with these 9 slots. So you're not making these blatant errors.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too, because since it is a singleton format, previously we were talking about having 4 copies of each card. Now you gotta search out these effects,
right?
Whether it's like we're talking about card draw, generic idea, or more specific to the commander, historic,
right?
You've got vehicles, you've got, like you said, legendary flyers, you've got legendary whatever, and I think once you nail down what the commander does, it's going to fill X amount of slots.
Right.
And then there's also, like we were saying, there's X amount of slots that are always going to be there, generally.
Right.
And once you have that nailed down, I think that is where people generally lean more into the things like card draw, the things that decks normally do, card draw, protection, ramping,
right? And
that ends up, quote unquote, honing the deck, and generally making it a little more powerful is when you take that 7x9 and turn it to, I don't know, like 9x3 and whatever's left for the other. Like people are focusing in more on the general commander things, no pun intended, and leaving aside the things that the commander itself wants to do, which in turn makes up for a faster game, for a more high-powered experience, but you're letting go to the wayside like the characteristics of the card,
right?
And I think that what I usually end up doing is I'm like, oh man, like this would be great if I had more card draw, but also I've played this deck 3 times. Maybe I should play it a few more times before I start fiddling with it. And I think that's a big thing that I have trouble with. I'm sure a lot of people have trouble with being like, oh, like is this deck good? Is this deck XYZ? I'm gonna tinker with it and tinker with it and tinker with it. And like, sure, like if you get, there are plenty of people out there who play multiple times a week. There are plenty of people out there who can only play every couple weeks. And it's frustrating to have a deck sit there, not be able to play it, and then want to fiddle with it. But like if you stick to the 7x9, it's going to be generally it's going to be playable.
If
that's where you want to start.
Right. And if you're using 7x9, and you've allotted one one slot to ramp. So you've got 7 ramp cards in your deck. Okay, so you know that, if you just played a game and you got too much ramp, well, just look at the setup. You know you don't have too much ramp. You have exactly the amount of ramp that you wanted in the deck. It's not that it's too much or it's not enough. The theory allows you to stay on track. Maybe the ramp that you've chosen isn't good enough. Maybe it could be better. Maybe it could be more on theme. But you don't. It really forces you to look at it and say, if I'm adding something or removing something from one of these categories, do I really need this to happen? Because it's one thing to swap cards in that same category. It's quite another thing to take them out of that category and go down to 6 or go up to 8. Because now you really have to say to yourself, is this really where this deck needs to be? And I'm not saying that it doesn't. I mean, I have plenty of decks that have way more than 9 pieces of ramp. And, I would argue that a lot of times you do need more than 7 pieces of ramp. But it's a good basis to start. And it also means that when you do tinker, you overlay that 9x7 onto your tinkering. So that way you're not pulling out I drew 5 pieces of card draw last turn and I needed this and this instead. So I'm taking 2 pieces out. Well, the overlay says that was just bad luck that round.
Right.
So it forces you to align into that. So
I think that's where it kind of comes down to how specific you are with these slots, because there's a difference between 3 visits and Soul Ring.
Yeah.
One is going to create you colored mana, the other one's going to create you colorless mana, but also on top of it, one is going to give you land. The other one is going to give you an artifact.
Right.
Which is significantly different to deal with, but also significantly different to play.
And each of them are going to run different.
Absolutely.
The value of each of them depends on the theme of your deck as well.
Yeah.
Maybe 3 visits doesn't work with whatever theme that you're going with. Maybe Soul Ring doesn't work with whatever theme you're going with. I suggest you take a look and be sure that you really that you really want to drop Soul Ring. But
I think
you get what I'm saying.
And I think too, with being more granular with what the slots are, you kind of look back at your commanders, seeing what they want to do, and get to do very specific, very fun things with the theming. You get to look at these. For instance, with Wrath, you get to flash in a card like Traxos, Scourge of Krug. It's a 4 mana 7/7 that comes in tapped and only untaps if you play historic spells. So then that furthers the historic theme.
Yeah.
It does this thing where you get to flash in a 7/7 at the end of somebody's turn, which you don't generally get to do. And playing with what the deck wants to do rather than what you think you should be doing lends itself more towards this 7x9, because if you're looking at those 9 slots as these very granular things of like, all right, like not only is this general creatures, it's big creatures that have this huge impact.
Right, and that's where 7x9 kicks in.
Right.
Like, you saw Traxos and thought, okay, this is perfect, this is awesome, great, but that's one of the 7 in that slot. So now you got to come up with 6 others. Well, what is it about Traxos that makes it so appealing in the slot? Is it that the fact that it references other artifacts, or is it the fact that it's a big artifact beater? So, I mean, and if the artifact beater is what you're looking for, well, then you can choose your large artifact or legendary creature that would go into that slot to fill that slot. So that way you get that effect much more regularly in your games, as opposed to that miracle moment when you actually pull the one Traxos out of 100 cards and get to play it with Wrath and make that happen.
Yeah.
So,
again, with Traxos, it fills multiple roles. It's a big creature, it's an artifact, it's a legendary. And finding those things that fit different slots is always a nice thing.
Right.
It makes the deck building interesting rather than just like, all right, I've got this package of 23 cards that are my ramp, and it's going to be the same throughout these colors regardless of what commander I play.
Yeah.
Which is why I find 5-color commanders so boring.
Well,
but
so when I've talked to people about this idea, whether it's 9x7 for commander or 9x4 for 60 card, quite often the response that I get is you're taking the fun out of the deck building experience, that you're turning it into this
equation,
this equation that sucks the
personality.
Well, it wasn't even the personality. It sucks the well, I guess personality is the best way, is probably a great way to put it. That takes the personality out of it. And my response is no, not at all. All this does is it puts a level of structure,
right,
overlay. When you start going back through this, like when you realize, okay, so I mean, practically speaking, virtually every deck is going to have ramp, card draw, and removal. Okay. Now, those are not going to be the same 7 cards for every single deck. You're going to choose the 7 cards in there based on your commander, based on the deck, the theme of the deck, what you want to do,
you have,
and what you have. So those slots, which stay the same in virtually every deck you build, are dramatically different in every deck. And then you've got the other slots that are either around, center around your commander or just around the whole deck theme that you've come up with. Those are all original and to you. All I'm doing is saying, hey, don't forget, if you really want this to happen, you really want to dedicate a slot to that, to make that happen.
And I think, what it kind of comes down to is like we're not trying to build optimal decks. I don't think that having structure in a deck makes it any more or less optimal, but I think it lets you play the deck. I think it lets you do anything, honestly. Like if you really lean into your theme, something's got to give. And eventually, if you lean too far into your theme, then you're gonna end up not being able to do the things you want to do, unless everybody just leaves you alone forever.
Right. 9x7 does not optimize your deck. It opens up the opportunities for fun.
Right. And I think that these are all great points, and I think that next week we should discuss, once you have your deck, once you've played it a few times, you're going to realize that your deck does certain things better than others, or it does things that you don't want it to do, or it doesn't do things you want it to do. So next week we're going to talk about replacements, taking things out, putting things in,
upgrades,
tune-ups. Yes, thank you. The old in and out, right? Anyway. That'll do it for us this week. My computer's slowly blowing up, so we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for listening. We're Temple of Falsepod. We're at Exo not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
I'm John.
Hey. Let's play some Magic.
We're gonna go play some Magic. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great night, and may your 5th land be the Temple.
Bye.
Wait, before you go, I just wanted to say thank you for listening. You can reach out to us via email at falsepodmtg@gmail.com or on Twitter at falsepodmtg. Bruce is at ManaBurned, and I'm at Andy Weekend, though you'll definitely notice I use the podcast Twitter far more often. Now that we've got you here, make sure you subscribe, rate us on whatever podcast platform you use. It helps us out. It gets us more reach. Subscribe to us on our YouTube channel. Like a video there. Leave some comments for more casual enjoyment. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back with some more timeless discussions about all things casual. So come hang out, and may your 5th land be the Temple. Bye bye. Should I do my best, Bruce? Bye.